The Fayetteville Public Library, and welcome to those watching through live stream as well. To assist the home viewers, when we get to the Q&A session, please raise your hand and use the microphone to ask the question. Otherwise, they won't be able to hear the questions at home. And before you leave today, please do take a moment to fill out the evaluations that we've left for you. Those help us to plan for future programs. And speaking of future programs, I hope you'll join us for another author talk next Tuesday, November 7th, a conversation with writer at risk Uchenna Awoke. And there are also calendars with all our November programs at the back of the room, so feel free to grab one. And I am just so delighted to have Rob Wells back at the library today. Dr. Rob Wells is a 2016 PhD alum of Merrill College and returned to the university in spring of 2022 after more than 5 years at the University of Arkansas, where he rose to the rank of associate professor and led Arkansas's journalism graduate program. Wells has more than 2 decades of business journalism experience at the Associated Press, Bloomberg News, and the Wall Street Journal. And while at Arkansas, Wells ran ArkansasCovid.com, a statewide daily data and news website reporting on the pandemic. He partnered with Merrill's Howard Center for Investigative Journalism on multiple projects, including the award-winning Nowhere to Go homelessness investigation. Wells is also the author of The Enforcers, How Little-Known Trade Reporters Expose the Keating Five and Advance Business Journalism. And today he will, of course, be talking to us about his newest book, The Insider. And books will be available for sale and signing following the talk. Please join me in welcoming Rob Wells.
Well, thank you all for being here. And Leah, thank you very much for the introduction and for hosting this event. So it's been 2 years since we've been in Fayetteville, and it's tremendous to be back. Deborah and I are really happy to be here. We miss Fayetteville, and we talk about it often with my students and my colleagues. They say back north, like, "What's it like in Arkansas? What's it like?" I go, "You wouldn't believe it. It's very nice. Good music scene, good people, and a lot of good friends, and a lot of them are here." It was. We left under pretty quick circumstances, and it was very awkward because it was in the middle of a COVID surge, and we didn't get a chance to really have a proper goodbye. So this is hopefully the weekend here we'll get a chance to reconnect. I really need to come back to Fayetteville to talk about this book because I wrote it here, and a lot of people who had quite a few people here that helped me with it. So I wanted to publicly thank Larry Foley and Jan Wicks from the journalism department, who were my supervisors at the time, and they helped support the research. Michael Pierce from the history department was instrumental in helping me understand labor history in the 30s, which was a big part of this book. And then there was Robin Roggio from the Mullins Library, who was just absolutely essential in getting archival material for me to research during the pandemic, which was really tricky. So there's a lot of Fayetteville in this book, and I really wanted to come back here and publicly acknowledge folks for this. And then to my great friend Jenna Shelton, thank you for sponsoring this with the Society of Professional Journalists Northwest Chapter, and for all your support, and I really appreciate it. So the presentation is about Willard Kiplinger. He's the founder of Kiplinger Washington Letter and the Kiplinger Personal Finance Empire. Show of hands, how many have heard of Kiplinger? Okay, this is a smarter than average group. And he's been a very big, iconic figure in business journalism, and nobody ever wrote a history about him. This is the first history about him. He, in addition to being an important journalist, this book shows that he was an influential actor in the New Deal, and I'll talk about that. So this book is going to be part like journalism history, and it's going to also talk a lot about history and how journalism is situated within that. The story centers really on events from, get this baby going here. probably help if I got the slides to here. There we go. And there we go. It centers on events, more than 100 years ago, really. But I think this story tells a lot about journalism today. I learned a lot about journalism business models and marketing and reporting in the process of researching this book. I really think that this book and the study of Kiplinger will tell us a lot about, how somebody who wanted to start a business or a journalism enterprise today would go about doing that. Anybody who wanted to start a YouTube channel or a website would get a lot from this exercise. Kiplinger innovated a lot in his career, and he did it with a very inexpensive form of media at the time. It was a newsletter. And newsletters right now are a very, very important part of the media ecosystem. All the big newspapers have their own newsletter operations. And they all really kind of pay tribute to the techniques that Kiplinger developed back in the time. There's a lot in here about the craft of reporting and how journalists can do this sort of work. And Kiplinger was a master reporter. He worked for the Associated Press and for smaller newspapers in Ohio, and really had that down. And I think that with the crisis that we see in the news industry and the closures of newspapers and the rise of news deserts, we had one University of North Carolina study saying there are 1,300 communities have become news deserts in recent years because of the restructuring. So with all this turmoil going on in the news industry, we need to find out what business models might work and how can journalism sustain itself. And I think Kiplinger gives us quite a bit of information on that. I'm going to talk about this and then talk a little about the archival research that went into this book. So just to get into Kiplinger's background, he was born in Bellefonte, Ohio, near Columbus in 1891, and died in Bethesda, Maryland in 1967, died a multi-millionaire. He was the first journalism graduate from Ohio State University, and this was at a time where journalism education was just beginning in the United States. So he was at the forefront of this movement of professionalizing journalism. He actually went to a college for this. Worked for the Ohio State Journal, worked for the Associated Press in Ohio, and then he wanted to get to the AP in Washington, and the AP wouldn't transfer him. And this was a pretty pivotal moment. It says a lot about his career and the sort of person he was. He would just take major risks throughout his career. So he just quit the AP in Columbus and moved to Washington and talked his way into a night reporting job. And he was very, very headstrong, really determined individual. At the AP, he had all sorts of really neat adventures. He was shadowing Woodrow Wilson while he walked at night through D.C. The president would go for walks, and an AP reporter would be with him. He ended up getting a scoop, talking to a group of women who were protesting for the right to vote. And he also learned that there was a big gap in the AP's coverage back then, and that was covering business and finance. And he knew that, the path for a great story is to follow the money. So he began to find, more stories in banking and finance and getting expertise in that area, and ran into some tension with the AP at the time. The AP became kind of risk averse with his more aggressive reporting on business and finance. He wanted to sort of, kind of push the limits of what was happening here and try to expose things and do some investigative work. And the AP was just like, you need to just write what the government said and kind of leave it at that. And so he began to chafe with the institutional confines of journalism at that time, traditional journalism. And he felt that that there needed to be more analysis of the news. That was one of the big things he was after. So he quit the AP and started his own business. First, he was a consultant for banks and was basically their Washington representative to give them information about what was happening in Washington. And that evolved into a news service and the Kiplinger Washington Letter, which was founded in 1923. Here he is with his reporting staff, highly diverse staff, representing many modern newsrooms today. That's actually not too far from the truth, but we see, his entrepreneurial streak here, time and time again, willing to take these risks, going out and finding, ways to serve his audience. And he picked up on a trend in the early 20s I found to be fascinating in this research. He felt that the audience was overloaded with information in 1923, with newspapers trying to keep up with books and magazines. And they needed someone to kind of digest all this and to put it into a format, news that you could use and how you can act on it and so forth. He wasn't the only one who saw this trend about information overload. There was DeWitt and Lila Wallace founded the Reader's Digest about this time. We had Henry Luce and Britton Hayden founding Time magazine. So this notion of information overload was very present in the 20s. I found that to be utterly fascinating going through this. And he wanted to structure his newsletter to serve these readers, so writing was really, really important. Keeping the writing very concise and very active and to serve the readers in a good way. So the editing that went into this newsletter was very intense. And here's a copy of the newsletter. It's a great multimedia product here. Highly static, no pictures, no crossword puzzles, no horse race results or anything. It was 4 pages, and he had a whole staff that went out and reported throughout Washington to find out what was going on that would affect businesses in Washington and what was happening with the political economy in DC at the time. This is building on a trend about newsletters that was just beginning to start in this era. There was the Whaley-Eaton newsletter that did kind of political intelligence in 1918. Kiplinger letter came along, and then he became very successful, and a lot of people began to produce newsletters to sort of copycat him. I talked a little bit about how newsletters are popular today, and you can think of like Politico and Axios. They're kind of following that same model that Kiplinger had of analytical reporting, sort of predicting what's happening. But newsletters have been around for centuries, and one study showed that handwritten newsletters actually trace back to the Roman Empire and in China in the Qing dynasty. Business newsletters were produced in 17th century Europe. Count Fugger, who produced this business newsletter about what was happening in the ports and talking about trade. And these early newsletters were absolutely essential for the rise of capitalism because they provided the markets with information about what was happening and allowed people to do price discovery. So this Kiplinger newsletter is the oldest continually published newsletter in the United States, and it celebrated its 100th anniversary in September. And the business people who wanted to get this concise information about what was going on began to become more and more popular over time. Hope you could see this chart here a little bit. So it just sort of chugged along with pretty low subscriptions, and then here comes the New Deal, and it just takes off and keeps on going. You can kind of see how the word got out that this was a must-read for the business community. And it wasn't just, large corporations. These were small businesses and banks all across the country began to get the word that they really needed to see what was going on with the Kiplinger letter. This trend made him a multimillionaire. He became the wealthiest reporter in the United States by the 1940s, according to Harper's Magazine. There were a lot of imitators that took up this idea of the Kiplinger newsletter, of writing very short, punchy, kind of analytical pieces. This is, I think, U.S. News and World Report had this tomorrow, and then Newsweek had Periscope, and there were quite a bit. McCall's Magazine had a Washington newsletter. You can see the format. It's pretty similar. One of the innovations he came up with was this weird way of writing called sweep line writing. And the idea was for someone to just kind of scan a page and to get the essence of what he was saying. And he did this by cutting out some verbs, cutting out conjunctions, and underlining phrases. And so you could like look at the page and just kind of like scan it and just kind of get an impression of what was happening. And that would serve as business audience. This sweep line writing was an utter heresy for AP style and anybody who cares about proper English. But it served a purpose, and as kind of ugly and clunky as it was, I thought it was really interesting that he would try to reinvent language to serve an information need for an audience. So he was a master reporter, and he was absolutely relentless in building up a source network. He would get this newsletter, and he would get people, he would send it out to individuals around the country who were influencers of the day. He would have readers pick up the phone and talk to him, and then he would use that as tips for stories and so forth. It was quite an enterprise, this interaction that he had, this audience engagement. And he had a really fundamental insight about journalism, which is it's a people business. You know, he was always networking and trying to build his networks and build what they call today your brand, right? Which kind of like chafes with me, but it is important that journalists get out there and try to build up their visibility. And so in a way, he was trying to, he's sort of anticipating some of the trends in social media today of using what was the media at the time, letters, and to network and to gain influencers, like we would with Instagram. So here's an example of one of his more successful outreach projects. It was with the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1931. He sends him a copy of the Kiplinger Washington letter, and someone on Roosevelt's staff, or maybe Roosevelt himself, writes back and says, well, I'd like to, sure, get a free subscription to this. 1931, Kiplinger is beginning to see how the election's going to go, and he's beginning to anticipate that this guy might actually become president. This helps make inroads with Roosevelt's staff, anticipating that a bunch of New Yorkers are going to be coming to Washington, and they'll need to understand what was going on. And so this helped him build contacts with the man on the left, who is Raymond Moley. Raymond Moley was FDR's chief speechwriter in 1932. Those of you who know a little bit about the New Deal, he was the head of the Brain Trust. And that was the group of the Columbia University professors that designed our social safety net. They created, out of these arguments and discussions, Social Security, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the National Labor Relations Board. Moley was at the center of that. He was, from his desk, started the National Recovery Act project, implementing that. Hugh Johnson got his first job when Moley took a set of files, put them on the desk, and roll up your sleeves and start working. And that became the whole NRA, National Recovery Act. Moley and Kiplinger became very, very close friends. And there was this relationship, which is another fundamental thing about journalism, is if you're really going to do it right, you want to have a little bit of a two-way street. You want to be giving and receiving. And so Moley was coming down from New York, He didn't know Washington at all. And Kiplinger had been there since 1918. So he was educating Moley on how Washington worked. And it became a very, very important point for Kiplinger in his business. He had a standing meeting with Moley I think every Friday in the old executive office building. And he'd go in there and Moley would tell him everything that was happening with the New Deal that he knew about, so long as he didn't quote him. And Kiplinger kept to that promise. And sometimes he would be sitting in that room, and there would be people would bust into the office with an emergency, and he just kind of raise a newspaper and listen while all this was going on. He overheard conversations with the president. So he got incredible insight, and this helped inform his reporting, which made the Kiplinger letter very, very important going forward. And from this, the Kiplinger letter had another weird quirk, is it didn't quote anybody. There were no quotes in this publication whatsoever. They were saying, trust me on the sourcing. And people did, but he felt that in Washington that the quotes were so self-serving and really that people weren't providing the truth and really talking about what was actually happening. So he just decided to have this ban on quoting people, and that's still to this day. Kiplinger had many important sources in Roosevelt's administration, and he began to play this role where he was selling the New Deal to businesses. And this is where the title of the book, The Insider, comes from. He was on the inside getting the business community to really buy into the New Deal. It was very controversial. This is the beginning of our modern regulatory state, really, And a lot of businesses did not want to sign on to it. And he was writing as a business journalist, which was very unusual at the time, that capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, has failed because of the bank failure in 1932. If there's any evidence of laissez-faire capitalism failing, it's when the banks all shut down nationwide. And what was going to come out of that wasn't clear. What was happening in Germany was the rise of a dictator. And there was some concern that the United States was at this precipice. And so he was selling the New Deal as the best option and urging businesses to act in a socially responsible way. So it was a very profound movement that he was part of this movement to really rescue capitalism out of the Great Depression. And I felt like, his contribution was important. He was talking in the background to the Treasury Secretary and to these other folks. He was trying to mediate disputes within FDR's cabinet. He was trying to promote people that he thought were good. And so he's doing a lot of material in the background, and he was, as a journalist, he was a political actor, not a partisan, but he was making a lot of choices and doing a lot of actions that helped advance activities in the public sphere. And there's quite a bit of work now being done on this in journalism history about journalists as political actors, especially in the era of civil rights coverage. So as this newsletter grew, here's an example of a small town banker in Kansas writing, saying, I'm going to renew my subscription. By the way, this is what's going on in my community, and maybe you could help me with this. And he created this system where if readers came in with a question, he'd have his staff research it and then call them back with the answer. And so there was this very intimate interplay between readers and the news organization. He played sort of this long game with his sources. He didn't really talk to the president and the Secretary of State. He was more interested in the second and third tier people. And this person was William McAdoo, who was a Treasury official in the Wilson administration. They stayed in touch. Then, by 1933, he's a US Senator from California. And here's a letter that he's writing to Kiplinger in November, Can you tell me what's going on in Washington? I don't understand what's happening. So long relationships with sources over decades, really. Pretty amazing that he was able to keep this trust over the years. Example of the doing the networking, trying to get the influencers to read the letter. This is Will Rogers. He had sent Will Rogers just randomly a subscription. Will Rogers writes back, put me on your list and send me the bill to Beverly Hills. A comedian is as unreliable sometimes as a Washington rumor. But this was, he would do this he would send out, letters to, subscriptions to British royalty, just hoping that they would talk about it, And it really helped with his getting his access. He used the telegrams as a way to sort of butter up his sources and let people know they were important. Here he is, he's reading Ray Moley's latest book, and just sends a telegram. I'm at page 362. This is great. It's exciting. He did a lot of freelance writing to build up his visibility in the 30s, and I was able to establish that he became very much a national figure in journalism with speeches and then all these clips in the New York Times and the Atlantic and other newspapers. Scribner's magazine, big spread in the New York Times in the Sunday edition. And then he was writing for Today magazine, which was edited by Ray Moley. Moley ended up leaving the administration, became a journalist, started this public affairs magazine that became Newsweek. Moley was actually on he was part of a group that was supposed to buy the Washington Post, and they failed. So he was potentially could have been the editor of the Washington Post in 1933. He was at that sort of level. He also took risks with technology. This is a really strange thing that he did, but there was a group of banks, I think it was the American Bankers Association, that wanted to sort of make the case that capitalism was still important during the New Deal and during the Great Depression. And so they sponsored a national broadcast of classical music, and they had Kiplinger talk in the middle of it about business news. And it's just a weird sort of mashup, but it was a way for him to get out to, further extend his reach into a national audience. So he works in this, Kiplinger is working in this field of specialized journalism. It's also known as business-to-business publications. It is a huge part of the media ecosystem. And business-to-business publications bring in $37 billion in revenue in 2021. And that's more than cable TV and newspaper ads in 2020. This area of the American Banker newspaper and Aviation Week and Space Report and Broadcasting and Cable, all these specialized publications make a lot of money, and they have very loyal readers. And this is what I'm trying to do in my research, is see how we can learn from the specialized journalism industry and apply that to broader range of publications. One of the things you do in the specialized news industry is you find one really big idea, and then you try to monetize that with very specialty spin-offs. And I've seen this in a couple other companies I've profiled. So he starts with the Washington letter, then he goes, well, we ought to do a tax letter, and then an ag letter, and then they start doing books. And all this building on the brand, trying to build up the marketing. He was an early adopter of direct marketing and direct mail. And when Kiplinger and his enterprise grew to a point in Washington, they needed a new location. They built a facility now where we're pretty close to where we live in suburban Maryland, in this office building called Editor's Park. It had printing presses and room for a couple thousand people. They were such a large presence in direct marketing, they had their own zip code. They were probably the largest user of direct marketing that the US Postal Service had at that time. So he was also a very big innovator in that sort of space. He branched out in 1947 after World War II and started the Kiplinger magazine, which is the first personal finance magazine. I've just written a new article about this for a business journalism history book. It's coming out next in January. And this is quite a tale about this magazine that was definitely not ready for prime time when it came out. But it was a very important magazine to kind of capture all of the post-war energy and the growth of the economy, with GIs coming back, the growth of suburbs, and the need for people to have reliable personal finance information. He was on the cutting edge of that. The first personal finance journalist, by the way, was Sylvia Porter, but Kiplinger had the first magazine. And then a little bit about how I did the research in this book. This is the grandson of Willard Kiplinger, Knight Kiplinger. He ended up taking over the family business from his father, Austin Kiplinger. Knight and my first phone call with Knight, just to sort of double check some facts and figures for a little article I was writing for an encyclopedia, went for an hour and a half. And at the end of that, he says, well, maybe I could send you out some documents to help you out. I go, sure, what do you have? He goes, well, I have my grandfather's unpublished autobiography. Oh, yeah, Knight, that would be fine. Then I have the company's unpublished history that we spent 5 years with and we just killed because we didn't like the way it came out. It's like, yeah, I'd like to see that, And then a couple of his dad's books and then some newspaper clippings. So that came in a FedEx box to 135 Oklahoma Way, and pick up the box. I go down to the journalism building. I lock the door and I go into the scanner and I scan for 4 hours. And then go back to FedEx and return it. And so that was my first insight about the level of material they have in their basement. There are 19 file cabinets. They kept everything. They carbon copied everything from 1919 on. Personal correspondence, tax records. They didn't let me into the other room that had all the company financials, but I got to go through this. I'm in the process now of trying to get this donated to the University of Maryland library system. It should be in the Library of Congress. Because what I showed you with the Roosevelt letters, that's original presidential correspondence, So I got one trip out here before COVID hit and scanned like crazy for 6 hours while Knight was talking to me the entire time. Left the tape recorder running. And so it was just an incredible experience to have this amount of material drop into my lap and to have this individual in the family willing to take a risk to open up this material to a stranger. But we saw, journalism through similar lenses. He had worked at Dow Jones. I'd worked at Dow Jones. We had a similar world outlook. And he knew my background in business reporting that I understood the significance of his grandfather's work. So I just wanted to wrap up by reading a section from the book. It's from the introduction, and I think it's sort of this remarks up to this point sort of contextualize why I think this section is important. And the section is called Why This History Matters. This untold history of the Kiplinger-Washington letter and its influence during the New Deal is relevant to as our society grapples with questions about the role of journalism in a democratic society. Kiplinger left the sidelines of traditional objective journalism, the straight news reporting that we all hear about, to explore more analytical forms of writing and reporting to tell deeper truths about the intersection of government and business. There have been similar concerns about the limits of objective journalism, and they're being debated in our era as journalists cover Black Lives Matter and the endemic corruption of the Trump administration. Straight news reporting only addresses the top layers of these complex matters, And it's fascinating that Kiplinger, covering the Woodrow Wilson administration, found traditional straight news reporting insufficient to inform society about the complexities of government activities. Kiplinger's approach is really instructive for this chattering class of modern cable commentators. He produced analysis, but this analysis arose from highly rigorous reporting, and he applied skepticism and independence of a traditional journalist to this analysis. He used those reporting skills to sift and process the onslaught of information of the day, the news and spin and rumors and propaganda, and he was not offering an empty cable news commentary. He demonstrated the independence of a business journalist by resisting party line of emerging neoconservative actors, such as the American Liberty League, which is kind of a pre-MAGA movement, really, and its millionaire business executives who are bankrolling this effort to, in a propaganda campaign, to reestablish laissez-faire capitalism. They were kind of like the Koch brothers of today. The Insider offers an important perspective on the ongoing debate about whether capitalism and democracy are compatible. A concentration of corporate power, rising wealth inequality, and a debate over living wage are among those issues prompting questions about the fairness and equity of modern capitalism. Kiplinger stood out in this era by supporting capitalism, but insisting that businesses consider their obligations as members of civil society. Businesses needed to participate in the democratic process and accept compromises, such as working with organized labor. In that sense, the book offers a dimension on the ongoing debate about liberty that's severely dividing our society. The conservative business leaders' defense of laissez-faire capitalism and the individual rights over societal priorities reflects the current bitter debate that we're seeing in our society today. The same argument was playing out in the corporate sphere in the 1930s as Kiplinger and others sought to convince recalcitrant corporations to accept government oversight for the common good. We learned from Kiplinger how a journalist can participate in the public sphere without being an explicit partisan. And Kiplinger's agenda was functional in nature to repair a society devastated by the Great Depression and describe a new world order for businesses and to help capitalism evolve in a modern era. So thank you all very much for listening. Appreciate it.
If you have a question for Rob, raise your hand and I'll pass you the microphone.
Wow, the microphone. I have a quick question. Well, not quick, actually. But, I mean, what was that initial connection like? I mean, it seemed like he was pretty open to, releasing his family's records. But do you call up? Do you say, like, hey, I'd like to look at these? How did that initial connection come about?
The initial connection was, in a way, kind of years in the making, if that makes sense, because I had worked for one of his top editors, Mark Willen, who actually helped me, proofread the book, was an editor of mine at Bloomberg. Then he went to Kiplinger, and he was the top political editor at Kiplinger for many years. So I told Knight, Mark was my editor. He goes, yes, Mark is, and I had Mark call him before I did this conversation. He goes, yes, Mark's told me about you. So there was that trust was there already. And then the conversation that we had, we had shared experience at Dow Jones. And then I talked to him about the trade press and some of my first book and so forth. And he it just resonated so deeply with him, and he was looking for someone to do this project. They've been looking for someone to write the company history, and they weren't able to pull it off. And then I called up. So the project found me. It just completely fell in my lap. And I remember getting off the phone, and I told Deborah, I said, I think I just found my next book project. So.
Hey, so I was kind of curious with all the different modern avenues for monetization of information, and just the fact that if there was information overload 100 years ago, today it's impossible to filter information. What are sort of the ways this model of specialized news can adapt both to monetize itself and find a sustainable niche?
Right, right. So when you think about, this type of business journalism, it's just a community paper, right? It's a paper for a specific community, and it's serving a need for that community. This just happens to be business people nationally. I've done some research on, a community paper that was serving the mortgage bankers and so forth. You go in there and you show that community that you're willing to call out the jerks and praise good behavior and do it intelligently and stick around. And in doing that, you can establish yourself, and that will have, according to this model from Kiplinger and from National Mortgage News, another publication I studied, and Tax News and a couple others, that will gain a lot of momentum and credibility with your readers, and you can do spin-off publications. In the process of doing that reporting, you just look for what is valuable that could be sold. So data is going to be something you're going to gather. You can repackage that and sell separate data products. So that's another way to monetize it. You can have conferences, which is what the National Mortgage News used to do. They would do conferences and charge. So there are different revenue streams. One of the interesting things about the Kiplinger business was Willard Kiplinger became a multimillionaire by the mid-40s. And he didn't know what to do with all this money, so he started buying property. Bought property in Florida in the 40s. Bought property in suburban Maryland in the 40s. He had this huge real estate portfolio. And by the mid-70s, the company was basically a real estate investment trust that was supporting journalism. And he sold some land to Florida Power and Light so they could build a nuclear power plant. It was that much he had so much land. So the idea of having some kind of, some capital base that can help support journalism sort of speaks to a philanthropy model, that can kind of support, it kind of goes to the Jeff Bezos model and also the public, nonprofit news model, which KUAF is trying to pursue as well.
I have a question about the writing style, right?
Yeah.
The sweep line writing feels like the clickbait writing of blogs these days.
Yeah.
It feels like provocative. I wanted to know whether it was a journalistic decision or a business decision because it was direct marketing. He felt like he had to provoke the reader.
Yeah. It was both. Yeah. So the really crisp journalism that engaged the audience helped his business. That's what blew up the business was, this high quality writing. And I was talking to somebody earlier today about it. I had to read like hundreds and thousands of these articles for this book, and it was pretty good stuff to read. It was like good journalism, the writing was good. It was very entertaining. So there was kind of a self-reinforcing cycle of good writing and journalism.
So the last time I was in the National Press Building, you could walk around each floor, and on every door there was a newsletter or some organization publishing something.
Right.
Are there still a lot of these things around, or have they fallen by the wayside? You talk about community. They were specific to a community. Yeah,
it's accelerated. The Wall Street Journal, since I left, has a newsletter operation that is just huge. There's one just for central bankers. You know, just anybody who cares about central banks, there's a newsletter for that. You know, there are newsletters for environmentally sustainable investing. And these letters really help with audience engagement and with brand recognition. They come to your email box. They're easy to get. You don't have to put on a robe and go out and find the paper in the bushes in the morning, you know. And so it's every major news organization has a pretty sophisticated MailChimp kind of outlet going on. It's a growth industry for young journalists, for sure.
I got a question about Rob.
Oh, no.
Most journalists, planning is this afternoon and history is yesterday. How did Rob get this interested in history?
Well, I think I've always been interested in it. And it just, you know, I don't want to be a moron and repeat mistakes of the past. Part of it, I didn't want to embarrass myself. That's why I kind of got interested in it. I felt like we as a society are prone to amnesia, and so if I study history, maybe I could be a little bit sharper than the average person. And then as I get into, you know, looking through these archives, it's like the ultimate investigative reporting trip. I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating, and to be able to piece these things together, you know. When I got that email from Stanford's Hoover Library with Ray Moley's correspondence from Willie Kiplinger, 250 letters that they had exchanged. And I was like, man, this is fantastic. And so Matthew Moore was working for me as a graduate assistant at the time. I said, Matthew, we're going to put this into a grid, and we're going to try to trace the back and forth of all this correspondence going from 1930 to 1965. So it's just, as journalists, the whole pursuit of the story and working with these documents is absolutely fascinating, I think.
You said really interesting things about the degree of sort of closeness that Kiplinger had to people, and also that he wanted this not to just be superficial, but rather analytic. I'm curious about, you know, what's the role of sort of quote-unquote journalistic objectivity in this? Was he ever accused of pushing an agenda? Did you find he was? How does that work?
Yeah. So I was looking for that time and time again, and I thought I had a really great case study when he was advising Ray Moley about a speech he was going to give to the National Association of Manufacturers in 1935. And the NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, was the main business group that was at the far right, pushing against the New Deal. They were the attack dogs. They would have been the Koch brothers, right? And so they had invited Moley to come speak to them. And Moley asked Kiplinger for advice. What should I do here? That would have been the perfect time to push your agenda, you know? And Kiplinger instead had advised him, like, you need to remind them about their social responsibility to society, you know? And you can say a couple, you know, bad things about the New Deal, but this is an opportunity to really kind of make the core case for the New Deal. So I didn't see him pushing the agenda. Politically, I put him at center right because he believed in free markets, you know, and then towards the 50s and 60s, he became more politically conservative. He supported Nixon over Kennedy in 1960. He was impressed with Nixon's foreign policy expertise, you know, and he had, you know, some. But I didn't see an agenda, and I was looking for it the entire time.
Dr. Wells.
Yes, Dr. Watkins.
So would you say then that Kiplinger was an advisor of some sort?
An informal
Roosevelt?
advisor, yes, absolutely.
Was it always kind of this backdoor way through Moley?
Yeah, absolutely. He was telling Moley and advising him how Washington worked and how he could get his message more effectively out to the business community, and things that they were doing that were pissing off the business community, and they shouldn't be doing it that way. And then he was trying to mediate disputes within the administration. There was one official in the administration who was gaining too much publicity. He said, you need to pull this guy back so he can get more on message.
Wasn't that kind of presumptuous?
Yes. He had great confidence in his analytical abilities, and they were pretty good. I mean, he overstepped, and as a person, you know, he was fairly acerbic to his staff sometimes. So not an ideal individual, but highly accomplished one.
I was struck by his social responsibility combined with his enthusiasm for capitalism, and I was first curious about how did he avoid being attacked, and then you pretty much laid out he had a lot of money and he had political allies.
Yes.
So my question now is, how did he develop his social responsibility point of view?
You know, I think he saw that organized labor was being unfairly demonized by the corporate sector. And it really offended him because he would go to the AFL's annual conference and report on it as a business event. And you know, he had really, really good sources within the labor movement. And he was always telling his business readers, you really need to, you know, at least talk to these people. Just don't write them off as communists, because it's this really reductionist, you know. So I think it might have come from that sense of fairness that, you know, the labor movement just wasn't being treated fairly. And that's probably the most direct way to answer that question, I'd say, yeah.
Other questions?
You gonna write about him more?
There's probably one more article I'll do for the time for the next presidential election about how he completely blew the Dewey versus Truman call. And he put out a copy of the Kiplinger Kiplinger magazine, says what Dewey will do as president against his staff advice. And he put it out earlier than he should and they tried to dial it back the night of the election. It was an absolute disaster, and it was arrogance in his political forecasting skills, and it cost him quite a few subscribers and some money. So I think that'll be like a kind of a good case study of how you know, a veteran political analyst can get it wrong in a really big way.
He did the same thing with Nixon.
He didn't predict Nixon. He didn't endorse Nixon. He would endorse individual candidates or predict that they would win, but he didn't do that for Nixon. He liked Nixon, which is kind of, you know, you don't love people you write about sometimes.
All right, I don't see any more questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you all
Rob,
for coming.
being
Appreciate
here.
it.
Let's give him another round of applause. And please see Daniel here at the back if you'd like to purchase a book, and then Rob will be signing here on the right-hand side. Thank y'all for being here.
All right.